as, and I'm quoting you, her evil colleagues. That is something you said on Strict Scrutiny in your podcast. And you, in that same podcast, you made a reference to Justice Alito. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that. And we certainly do reference Justice Alito, so I believe that, but I don't recall specifically
your comment
what.
There was that he was an abject misogynist. So since this is your podcast that you hosted, and this was your opinion on that podcast, would you like to provide explanation about why you think conservative justices are evil and why you would think Justice Alito was a misogynist? Do you care to explain yourself?
Welcome back to Right View Nation, where we don't sugarcoat the truth, we expose it. If you're tired of liberal lies, media gaslighting, and leftist hypocrisy running unchecked in Washington, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Folks, you're not going to believe what I just watched. It's one of the most shameless displays of radical, elitist arrogance that we've seen in a long time. And believe me, that's saying something in Biden's America. Today, I want to talk about something that cuts to the core of this nation: respect for our Supreme Court. Because what just happened in a Senate hearing is a blatant attack on the very foundation of our judicial system, all coming from the mouth of an entitled, left-wing law professor who thinks it's okay to call Supreme Court justices evil. Yes, you heard that right, evil. Let's break this down. So Senator Marsha Blackburn, one of the few voices of reason left in that chamber, confronts this professor, who, by the way, hosts a podcast with the oh-so-intellectual name Strict Scrutiny. And on this podcast, this academic elitist decides it's perfectly fine to slander Supreme Court justices simply because they don't share her woke worldview. She actually called Justice Alito an abject misogynist and referred to his conservative colleagues as evil. Now let me tell you something, folks. This isn't just name-calling. This is the left delegitimizing our institutions from the inside out. These are people who claim to be champions of democracy, but when democracy doesn't go their way, when the highest court in the land dares to rule based on the Constitution instead of liberal feelings, they lose their minds. And what does this professor do when Senator Blackburn confronts her? She dances around the issue. Suddenly she doesn't recall her exact words. Oh, how convenient. But of course, she does admit, with a smug little grin, that her podcast frequently shows a lack of respect for the court's writings. Let that sink in. These are the people educating our future lawyers. These are the voices influencing the next generation of judges, prosecutors, and politicians. And they think it's perfectly normal to throw respect, integrity, and judicial impartiality right out the window if the justices don't bow to the woke agenda. But here's where it gets even more serious.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor, I do want to come to you, and I want to return to the conversation about calling the Supreme Court justices evil. You host a podcast, correct?
Yes, Senator.
And that is called Strict Scrutiny, correct?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. You made those comments on your podcast. And, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit the recording of that podcast for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In that podcast, you referenced, as Senator Kennedy said, to Justice Kagan an opinion, and you referred to the conservative justices as, and I'm quoting you, her evil colleagues. That is something you said on Strict Scrutiny in your podcast. And you, in that same podcast, you made a reference to Justice Alito. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that. And we certainly do reference Justice Alito, so I believe that, but I don't recall specifically
your comment
what.
There was that he was an abject misogynist. So since this is your podcast that you hosted, and this was your opinion on that podcast, would you like to provide explanation about why you think conservative justices are evil and why you would think Justice Alito was a misogynist? Do you care to explain yourself?
I would have to look at the transcript, Senator. I think that the dismissive approach to sex equality arguments in the Dobbs case was deeply concerning. One paragraph in the opinion suggests that there's no sex equality problem with abortion restrictions or prohibitions. I think that's deeply wrong. And in the more colloquial sort of mode of a podcast conversation, that is probably what I intended to convey, that he discounted very serious sex
you were
equality concerns.
angry. You were angry and you let your emotions get the best of you, is basically what you're saying.
I don't think I'm saying that, Senator. I was having a conversation, and I am sure I was criticizing Justice Alito. We frequently do on my podcast.
Okay. Would you call that lack of respect?
As podcast, in the context of a podcast, we frequently. I will stipulate that we frequently demonstrate a lack of respect for writings of the Supreme Court justices.
That is good to hear that from you, that you have that admission of guilt. So thank you for that. I've got a question for the entire panel. There was discussion about Section 1507 and protesting outside of judges' residences, justices' residence. And I've got a bill, the Protecting Our Supreme Court Justices Act, and it would deter intimidation of Supreme Court justices. And in the exchange Senator Cruz had earlier, he referenced that purposeful intimidation. This would change, it would increase the maximum term of imprisonment for violation of Section 1507 from 1 year to 5 years, and increasing the maximum time, jail time for a protester under 1507 is, I think, an effective way to deter this intimidation of our justices. So I'd like to hear from each of you on this. Professor Blackman, I'm going to come to you first, and then just a very quick, short answer from each of you.
Sure. I think it's a good idea, and I think it should be enforced vigorously as well. We mentioned Judge Kaczmarek before. He said several death threats against him. They were ultimately plea bargains. So I think there's a serious problem that needs to be addressed with enforcement.
Okay. Professor Shah?
You know, I think that any law that also touches protected First Amendment conduct would need to be scrutinized carefully, so I would need to take a look. I'm not prepared to take a position here.
Outside of a...
No, this is about protest outside of... Protests or
Intimidation.
Okay, so violence, absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about increasing penalties for violence, I would absolutely support that, yes.
Okay, great. Professor?
I certainly think we need to carefully scrutinize the level of violence and the threats against Supreme Court justices and other judges, as we saw when there was a threat against Justice Kavanaugh's life, right, an attempted threat against him and his family. So it underscores the seriousness of the issue, and I think it's important for Congress to take a look at this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Blackburn brings up a bill, the Protecting Our Supreme Court Justices Act. It's designed to increase penalties for people who protest and intimidate justices outside their homes. Because let's not forget, Justice Brett Kavanaugh and his family were almost assassinated because of the radical left's incitement. That's not speculation, that's fact. But when asked about the bill, the same panel of professors gives us the classic academic dodge. We have to balance that with First Amendment rights. Oh please, listen, no one is saying you can't protest. You can protest till your lungs give out. But what you don't get to do is show up outside a judge's house, screaming threats at their children, trying to force a decision at the barrel of mob intimidation. That's not the First Amendment, that's anarchy. And frankly, it's disgusting. One of the professors, Josh Blackman, thankfully had the backbone to say it straight, that these threats are real, that judges have received death threats, and that we need to enforce the law vigorously. Amen to that. But the rest? Just more leftist legalese trying to water down the urgency of the problem. Trying to make room for the kind of protests that led to bricks flying, fires burning, and police stations getting torched during the summer of mostly peaceful protests. Let me tell you what's really going on here. The radical left has failed at every level. They can't win in the courts, so now they want to undermine the courts. They can't win on facts, so they attack the character of the men and women who uphold the Constitution. This isn't about Roe versus Wade anymore. This isn't about Dobbs. This is about the left trying to delegitimize any ruling that doesn't push their gender theory, their race essentialism, or their climate religion. They've spent the last decade screaming, "Threat to democracy." And now they're the ones encouraging mobs to gather outside the homes of Supreme Court justices. Hypocrisy. That's not a strong enough word. It's treachery, and it has to stop. At Right View Nation, we stand for the rule of law. We stand for the Constitution. And we damn sure stand for the men and women who are under attack simply for doing their jobs. So here's what we need. Congress must pass the Protecting Our Supreme Court Justices Act. We need to name and shame every academic poisoning the next generation with this radical nonsense. And most importantly, we must wake up America before it's too late. Because if they can call justices evil today, what do you think they'll call you tomorrow? If you're fired up, good. You should be. Like, comment, and share this video with every God-fearing, Constitution-loving American you know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because we're just getting started. This is Right View Nation, where we don't back down, and we never bow to the woke mob. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.